So we are going to talk about Jim Crow. But before we do, I wanted to touch on the Compromise of 1877. Okay. Now, the Compromise of 1877 was a deal that was made in Congress, and it was something that ultimately ended Reconstruction, and it ushered in the Jim Crow laws. Okay. So we're going to take a closer look, and we are going to start with a little backstory. Okay. Now, the 1876 presidential election was between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden. And at that time, it was the most contentious presidential election in the United States. Can you tell me what the most contentious presidential election in the United States is now? And you really should know what it is. Yeah, yeah. Now, that 1876 presidential election was a hot mess because of South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. Yeah. Florida had 4 electoral votes, Louisiana had 8, and South Carolina had 7. All of them were for Tilden. But the elections in those states were influenced by fraud and violence. Yeah. The most extreme case was in South Carolina, where there were an estimated 150 black Republicans who were murdered. Fun fact: the election riots of 1876 involved the Democratic Party in South Carolina taking back their government from the Republicans with violence. Extreme violence. Yes. So, the Republican-controlled returning boards, the ones who counted the votes, in all 3 states, argued that fraud, intimidation, and violence in those states invalidated the votes. They said, I'm sorry, no. You actually killed people to get those votes for Tilden, so that's a hard pass, right? And they threw out the Democratic votes, right? So all 3 boards awarded the awarded the state's electoral votes to Hayes. Okay? Okay. Oh, but it gets better. It gets better. Yeah. So in Oregon, we have a Democratic governor who disqualified a Republican federal office holder, okay? Because he was like, well, electors can't be office holders. Okay. And then in 4 states, you had 2 conflicting electors, okay? You've got electors for Tilden and electors for Hayes. That's not possible, right? Or legal, right? We learned that from a certain former president, right? So, Congress is like, I think we're confused. There's a lot going on here, and we still don't have a president. So what are we gonna do? Okay? So the Republicans said that they had the right to count the votes. And the Democrats were like, oh, wait a minute, hold up. No, I think we have the majority. We have the right to count the votes. Okay? But eventually, they passed the Electoral Commission Act, and they established a commission that included, what was it? 5 senators, 5 representatives, 5 Supreme Court justices, and they all got together to decide which votes to count, and they got together to resolve any disputes. Okay? Now the commission voted 8-7 to award the electoral votes from South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, and one from Oregon to Hayes. That would make him president. But the Democratic members of the committee were like, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Okay? Because remember, they originally voted for Tilden. And they were willing to fight. We know this. They're willing to fight, okay? And the Republicans knew that they're ready to fight, okay? So they knew that they were going to have to make some concessions to avoid the violence. And the Democrats knew that the Republicans were willing to make concessions to avoid the violence. And the Democrats wanted two things: control over their own states and subsidies for railroads. So, in the end, an agreement was made. The Democrats agreed to accept Hayes as president, and in return, they wanted removal of all the remaining federal troops from Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. They wanted the right to deal with black people without Northern interference. They wanted the appointment of at least one Southern Democrat to Hayes's cabinet, the construction of another transcontinental railroad using the Texas and Pacific in the South. That never happened. And legislation to help industrialize the South and restore its economy following the Civil War and Reconstruction. That never happened either. Hayes did remove the troops from the South. Yeah. And yes, he strongly supported black people's rights to vote and protection of their civil rights, but ultimately he traded the civil rights of black people for the presidency. And we know the rest of the story, right? Once Rutherford B. Hayes pulled the remaining federal troops out of the South, white Southerners systematically disenfranchised black voters through poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation. And we also know that they created segregated societies that used terror and violence to oppress black people. And we know that this was the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of Jim Crow. So tomorrow, we'll start talking about Jim Crow.